Welcome to Mapping the College Audition, a podcast where we explore the landscape of the college theater world and try to demystify this daunting audition process. I'm your host, Charlie Murphy, director of MTCA, that's Musical Theater College Auditions, and today we have got an ungodly good show lined up for you. Don Wadsworth from Carnegie Mellon University, who is one of those magical, special people in my life. All artists have them, those people who believe in you early on and then really promote and advocate for you, and Don was very much that for me. I met him when I was 17 years old, and we have maintained a close relationship up to and through my attending Carnegie Mellon, and still really have a closeness to this day. You'll definitely hear that I'm a bit saucier than I am probably with the average college professor, and of course that is why. Right after the call, I was able to introduce Elizabeth and Solvay to Don. He hadn't met either of them yet, and it was just a really special moment to me, as was the whole interview. It was special. So no pressure, of course, but I do hope you enjoy the episode. Before we get to it, I'm just going to say to my senior families out there, I'll be seeing many of you over the next few weeks as we gear up into Unifieds, but just keep showing up. Keep advocating for yourself. We're going to talk a lot about advocating in these blurbs. But keep advocating for yourself in those auditions. Keep trusting the process. Keep living in the moment. Discover something new in each audition. And most importantly, keep having fun. You could throw out 90% of the advice and training and all the stuff that you've got. If you can show up with curiosity and have joy in each of those rooms, you're going to do really well in this process. And with that, let's get into the interview with the inimitable Don Wadsworth. Well, we are honored and excited and just a little bit titillated to have the wonderful Don Wadsworth from Carnegie Mellon on the pod. Don is a teacher, an actor, a voiceover artist, and a voice and dialect coach, among many other hyphens. He has a BA from Point Park College and an MFA from University of Pittsburgh. He's done voice work extensively for actors on Broadway, off-Broadway, feature films, etc. He's coached dialects on shows like A League of Their Own, Warrior, many others. As an actor, he can be seen on Netflix, The Chair and Smart People and Mysteries of Pittsburgh and many more. And he's also has a robust voiceover career where we're going to get a preview of this sonorous voice in this episode, but it also exists in radio and television, video games, and maybe most notably, he's the voice for the New Testament for Watchword Productions. So he's literally the voice of the Bible. So if that starts being imagined as you hear him talk, you're not wrong. Maybe we'll make Meghan put that link in the show notes. Just a reminder about Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I know you've heard this before from Catherine's episode. They take about 12 acting and musical theater majors each year, offer degrees in BFA in acting, musical theater, a couple other degrees. Don, welcome on the pod. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. I'm well and happy to be with you again.
Do you know how intimidating it is to speak into a microphone while you're looking at your voice and speech professor? Like, I just feel like I'm being judged constantly where you're like, that's not quite how I would have articulated that. Is that what's happening on your mind?
I am not judging in any way, shape, or form. And you know, I love you and I've always respected you and your amazing sense of humor.
Okay, great. Well, let's start off with a softball then, if that's what you are asking me. I just want to hear a little bit of how does one become a Don Wadsworth? Right? Of course, I mean that question in so many ways, and we'll talk about maybe especially the voice and speech expertise a little bit more in the later half of the show. But how did you find yourself to this specific career at Carnegie Mellon?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I'll try not to go on and on about it, but I want to tell you the end point first, which is that I think a lot of people end up in surprising ways, surprising places. I think it's important for young actors to have some ideas of goals ahead of them, but then there's reality. Then there's the career, which will take you any number of different places. And so, being in school, it just makes a lot of sense to do your best in every possible area because you never know where that's going to end up. So as it turned out, when I was in school, I believe it was 4 different voice and speech teachers. And so I had different kind of, agenda in front of me. And I think my view of it was that I was working the best way I could every year because, quite frankly, I knew absolutely nothing. And I am starting to appreciate how important it was for me to know that, to admit that,
To know that you knew nothing, you're saying. To know how little you
to
knew.
know
Yeah.
that I knew nothing.
Mhm.
Right. Um, because I think the quality of my listening
Mm.
and my desire to just do everything I possibly could to learn anything was very high. I knew that I hadn't even when I started when I was like 15 or 16, something like that. I had never even seen a play, and so I don't even know how I knew that the acting and the theater thing was
Mhm.
going to be my deal. I didn't have any history, any connections in any way. So anyway, so I went into this with the idea with my eyes very wide open because quite frankly, I didn't know anything. And
Mhm.
I was in a class of, I thought, really, really interesting kids. I thought they were just fantastic. And I don't remember ever comparing myself to them, but I just knew that for myself, I needed to learn everything.
Mhm.
So it was a while before any of those teachers would say to me, you're really good at this. And when that finally happened in my third year with Edith Skinner, who was like, you know, the hero of this world,
The
the
Edith
speech
Skinner.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was the coach of the country, quite frankly. And when she let me know that I was doing a really good job and she wanted to help and support me, I thought, oh,
Mm.
I didn't know I was good at this. I was just
Mhm.
doing my job like everybody else. And so she was very, very kind, very supportive, and all of that. So that's cool. So then I finished school. I go out and start auditioning as an actor, which was my only real goal.
Mhm.
And I started getting cast, which was great. And I was very much into Shakespeare, and I certainly loved doing any kind of dialects and accents. Um, and I was in a show once. I think I was still probably in my 20s, maybe, but I was pretty young. And in the show, there was an actor who was struggling to kind of make his accent work.
Mhm.
And I didn't judge this. I didn't know anything about what he had to accomplish. And the director at one point said, "Do you think you could help this actor
Hmm.
with his accent?" And I thought, "Oh, I never thought of that." And at that point, I didn't know of any. I never heard of a person who had a job as a dialect coach. I think there probably were a few for maybe some very big movie stars, but
Mhm.
not a lot. So at any rate, I said, "Well, okay, I'll give it a shot." I think it was a Hispanic accent. And so I did, and I thought, "Oh, that was really, really cool.
Mhm.
I liked that. That was fun." And I hope I was helpful, and I thought maybe I was. And then so that show happened and went away, and then, a while later, there was another production in which I was not cast, but there were, actors in there working on accents, and, again, the director said, "Do you suppose you could help some of these actors out? I mean, you did have Edith Skinner as a teacher, didn't you?" And I went, "Well, yeah, that's true." And I think I learned a lot from her. And so then I did that, and that's how that all started. And then this job as a coach began to become a reality. And I thought this is cool because my goal, and I was smart, I think, to have a goal this young, was just to work. I didn't care anything
Mhm.
about resumes or bios or money or any of that stuff. I just wanted to work. And I started to see myself as being an actor who could maybe land maybe two shows a year or something like that, which would be okay. But then as a dialect coach, I started to see that actually I could be working a lot more. I could
Mhm.
maybe get four shows or something like that in that same amount of time. Um, and now I'm working, six productions a year.
Mhm.
This was way better for me. The idea of just working and working and at that time it was only theater, was really, really fantastic for me.
Mhm.
And of course, when you're on the job, you need to know what you need to do. So you keep learning. And while I probably can figure out how I could do a high British dialect, I needed to find out how to teach other people to do
Mhm.
that, which is a slightly different, deal. So that's how that started. And then because people knew that I could do these accents, other things started to happen in like the voiceover world.
Mhm.
And so while I was pretty aggressive about looking for work for myself, it turned out that sometimes people were just asking me to do these things, and I was just thrilled because I was working.
For the listeners in the future, when you're listening back to this, that was about a 3-hour story. So just when you hear the 5-minute version, I just really want you to appreciate Meghan's editing skills of just how much we haven't even gotten to Carnegie Mellon yet. We're just at the, he's like 23 at this point.
Thank you for that.
No, but then how did you find your way to Carnegie Mellon?
They found their way to me. Now, the thing was, as I said, I knew nothing about theater. I didn't know about training. I didn't know about schools or anything like that. But I did know that there was this great place called Carnegie Tech. As far as I knew, that was the palace of actor training,
What this
And
was, still is, Don, still is.
yeah, I know, but I'm saying at that time,
Was, yes.
that was the
5 years
idea
ago.
of, where you would want to be. But there was no possible way that I could consider that as a student in the program because I couldn't even afford the bus fare to the audition. So I just kind of let that go. But I always wanted to be there, and my idea of what that school was in my imagination turned out to be exactly what it was when I got there as a teacher. I was right. I knew it was going to be difficult and challenging and creative, and that I would be lucky enough to be in a population of fantastic people. But at that point, when I was 17, 18 years old, that was just not even remotely possible.
That was definitely my experience of Carnegie Mellon as well. Of like, often maybe it's the timing of when I went there that we always compared it to Hogwarts, but it was like Hogwarts that didn't disappoint. It was like, it really stayed magical. It really was, you're like, it from the outside, it seemed like that. And then it really felt that way on the inside, at least to me. I mean, everyone had different experiences, but yeah.
Well, I totally agree. Absolutely.
We're going to get more specifically into a couple ways moving forward, some of the different vocal coach, dialect coach, et cetera. But I wonder if we could take a little bit of a step back, maybe especially for our music theater applicants and their parents who might not really know what like voice and speech or a voice and speech class is, right? Certainly, some actors out there, have heard of Edith Skinner, but not necessarily every person. She's not necessarily a household name to a non-actor. So what do we mean when we say voice and speech? And if we want to do a little bit of how voice is different from singing voice and where speech maybe is distinct from accents and dialects, or just a little bit of glossary of terms that we're going to talk about today.
Sure, of course. Absolutely. That's very smart. So sometimes you'll see in a list of courses, voice and speech as a course. I taught that kind of an arrangement for a while. I quite liked teaching voice and speech together. And voice, basically, I'll just reduce it down to this, means that actors need to be able to fill a big space. And they need to make sure that everybody, even in the corners and the sides of the theater and all the way in the back, it has the same advantage of learning about the play and and stepping into the play as people in the front row. And so we wanted power, but we also are looking for kind of variety. Is there lots of ways of using your voice to make sure that the text is clear and solid and that the audience actually cares about the character? So that's one element of it. In the speech end of it, you're looking more now, not so much for power, but for clarity. We need to know exactly what's being talked about, make sure that it is clear and not only just powerful. So that's an important aspect of the work. Now, sometimes whenever I take my students from the classroom and put them on the stage at the Carnegie, we have a 500-seat theater, so it's a good test of making sure that we can get our voices all the way to the corners, and also aid that with clear delivery. Because one needs to, in the process of rehearsal and developing a character, you're naturally thinking like, well, what does my character look like? How does my character move? What am I doing, physically to the character? And then you also have to think like, well, who is my character insofar as communication skills? Are they good speakers? Where did they learn to speak? What can I reveal about the character by the way that I speak? Some folks like to think of every character, every play that they do being a dialect. Because there are modern, casual, fully American ways of speaking that don't require a lot of finesse.
Right. But a dialect of yourself. So the way you speak, but just me a little lower class or me a little bit different. Yeah.
Like that, for example.
Yeah.
or maybe the opposite. And
No,
you need to go to
there's no
school.
higher class than me. No, I start at the top. So anything
I,
was just lowering if it's right.
I was using the metaphorical
Oh,
me.
the metaphorical you. Okay, I fully understood. Yeah, I understand.
Um, so one should aim for at some point in the training, like the most challenging level of speech.
Hmm.
Like what is the cleanest possible way that a character might speak, and make sure that that looks natural,
Uh-huh.
in case you need that.
Uh-huh.
So you look at it, you look at the dialogue on the page, and you say, well, this character is clearly very well spoken, and so therefore you've got to come up to that. So that's the speech, but it starts to also bleed a little bit into the dialect world. Now let me just make this clear in case anybody's interested. People say dialects and accents, and in my world those are two slightly different things. Dialect is a version of the way you speak. So for American actors, dialects include things like a Brooklyn dialect, a Southern
Hmm.
dialect, like that. And accents are languages that one tries to speak, but is not your native language.
Uh-huh.
So for Americans, French is an accent, German is an accent, Russian is an accent.
Those are all the terms. We've defined the glossary of terms. This is everything I wanted from you. Um,
We're done.
I do feel like, yeah, it's I'll sometimes get parents who will look at, I'm paying $50,000 a year, and they'll see the terms on this stuff, and it looks like speech and movement and clowning, and they're like,
Yeah.
what is this stuff? It feels like it's kindergarten or whatever. It's like my child knows how to move. But some of that stuff, I think it is important for an outside perspective if you're seeing what you're about to enter into, of just what this actually means. What are we doing all this for?
But also, one never knows what aspect of the theater, the performing, that one's going to go into.
Yeah,
I mean, you could be in a Shakespeare class in school and think, I'm never going to be in a Shakespeare play. And then lo and behold, you are.
yeah.
And so things happen, and you're surprised, and you say, thank goodness that I was, fully awake whenever we did those classes, because now it's really turning out to be useful.
I always talk about that. It seems like the classes I thought I was going to use the least were one of the first ones I ended up going, oh, I am coming to this thing. Oh, I am going to use these colors that we did
I
in movement class, or
know.
some of these things go. I was like, when am I ever going to use this? You do.
I know.
At some point in your career, you
That's,
will. Um,
that's
I want to go. I do keep promising the second half will be deep on voice and speech, but I just thought I would do a rapid fire on Carnegie Mellon. Right, all of our listeners have heard our wonderful episode of Catherine Moore, since all of our listeners listen to every episode. But I do think some of these questions that are more subjective and intangible, it can be nice to hear some of the different perspectives. So I'm not going to ask you the kind of boring logistical questions. These are just going to be the gooey, artistic, how do you feel about this ones? And I'll go rapid fire. Only going to give you a couple of them. But I would love to just start with, like, in your experience of the 9 decades you've been at the school, like, what do you think it means to be a Carnegie Mellon student? Like, what qualities are you looking for when you're seeing this is a Carnegie Mellon student? This person feels like they belong in this magical castle. What sets them apart from all the other actors that you see?
Huh. Well, okay. I think that's a good question, and a little tricky to answer. Um, so I think for your students, your former students, and maybe current ones, and maybe everybody already knows this, but let me just say it. I think it behooves anybody to be looking at what any school's alums are doing in the business now. And you can't go back to the 60s or the 70s. You
Hmm.
have to look at people who have been graduated in the past few years, because they're going to be in that same training and with those same
Hmm.
teachers.
Right, you're saying
So
don't count Ted Danson for Carnegie Mellon or whatever.
Ted
That's a
Danson
whole
is
different school.
exactly what I was
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah,
of
it's just
course.
like you're like that's amazing, but that was everybody was different at the school back then.
And Holly Hunter, and yes,
Yeah,
and God bless all of them. And we love Ted, and Ted has been back, and so is Holly, and they're great. In fact, Holly came in at one point, and we worked on some Shakespeare together
yeah.
not that long ago. But anyway, so I think those people who have real careers, not just like we're really lucky to be in a show, but have real careers, are
Hmm.
showing a lot of range, and the openness to try things that might be a little different, a little bit scary,
Hmm.
but also have, I think, enough confidence, Charlie, that even though they might go into something scary, um, they're not starting from zero.
Yeah.
They know that there's enough confidence in what they've done before. They've done some pretty tricky shows, probably in school. And so I think the idea of having the ability to go in lots of different places you wouldn't necessarily expect. When I started, I never, ever thought that I would end up in film or
Uh-huh.
television because I only knew theater. And I was happy and I would have been thrilled to just keep doing that. And then when the film came along, I thought, well, it's not that different than what I've done. I've got to play to the microphone and not to the 26th row.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to make sure that it's in me, but I don't have to push to show everything.
Uh-huh.
So I'm trying to answer your question about what's the ideal situation. I think the ideal situation is that people take advantage of everything that's given and they run with it. And even at first, it might not be easy or successful. They're gonna jump in there and give it a good, give it the college try. I
Yeah.
have to tell you this in auditions, because I've auditioned a bunch of classes, several thousand kids, quite frankly. And in the audition, it's not that you're always looking for like the finished product,
Uh-huh.
because there is no such thing at 17. There just isn't. But if I see something that I think is really interesting and I say, can we do that monologue again, only this time, racka, 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 racka,
Mm-hmm.
and the student goes, oh, yeah, great. I think, oh, I already love this kid. Great.
Uh-huh.
Because you just said you're willing to try to go to different places. That's exactly what I think we should have.
So you're really sniffing out, and I've heard a couple different versions of this. You're sniffing out openness. You're sniffing
Yeah.
out the ability and maybe the willingness for versatility, even if the student at 18 isn't completely versatile in every way. But you're looking for that, in terms of going, I want that
Willing.
kind of student, the willingness to play. I'm also going to quote you back to you, since I sometimes will quote you to our students. You said something, and I'm going to paraphrase, of like, I think of talent as sensitivity. I think you said at some point in school of like their ability to be sensitive to language, sensitive to the emotional. It's like that there's something that you're speaking toward of sensitivity, meaning sensitiveness or whatever, for in their ability to be sensate and be feeling, which in some ways I guess is a version of openness. You look at me like you don't remember saying that at all. You're
No,
like,
no, absolutely. No, I believe in all of that. Absolutely. Because the word talent does come up,
right.
and you say, well, what is it?
What is it for actors? I mean, for musical theater majors, a lot of our listeners are musical theater. They think of talent and they know I can belt a high C, I can kick my face. There are more objective skills with dance and singing versus acting. It is more subjective. It's hard to know.
But talent doesn't necessarily have to just be technique.
Correct.
It can also be the open heart that says, let me go in there and explore this and see if I can find this sometimes inside me.
Yeah.
Even though this character is radically different from me, I might be brave enough to go in there and look around and see if I could identify.
Yeah. And I guess what I was saying with the singing versus dance is that for acting, I would say most of what you're looking for is likely not technique from an acting perspective. You're not hoping to go, oh, beautifully elocuted with that. You're like, you're going to teach them that over the 4 years. That if they're 17, 18, I can't imagine that you're looking, we'll talk about some of what you are looking for, but I can't imagine it's a lot of acting technique.
Not technique, no.
Right. You're
No, no,
looking
no.
for that talent, that sensitivity, or that ability to learn, right? There's some sometimes indefinable. I was trying to get our previous guest, who's an agent from Stewart Talent. I was trying to say, like, what are you looking for with it? He was like, it's just it. It's what's gonna pop. It's what I was saying.
No,
Yeah,
no.
it's hard to say. It's hard to say
I
what it is
know,
that
I
you're
know.
looking for.
But let me give you an example, though, okay? So years ago, a student came in to audition for us, and he said he was going to do this particular Shakespeare piece. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, oh no, I'm so sorry that he said that because this is not the part for him,
Mm-hmm.
But I said, okay, let's have a go, So he does this piece from King Lear. It was Edmund from King Lear.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, he's just not the typical Edmund at all.
Mm-hmm.
But then he did it. I thought, oh, it's really smart. Good job, So I said, well, let's play around a little bit. Let me ask you to try this in a couple of different ways. He goes, sure. So then I go, okay, let's try the monologue instead of being something that kind of gets delivered straight to the audience, which is one way to go. How about if this was kind of like some sort of inner prayer for yourself? And he goes, ooh, okay. And he tries this piece, in like just a couple of words. Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law, my service is are bound. And I go, and he did it, and it was very internal, but I still got it. And I could see him kind of searching for an answer. And I went, oh, well done. Okay, now I'm getting greedy.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's try something else. Okay, not a prayer at all, but a justification. Now I want to see you argue with yourself. Okay, so now it's a very active thing. Jumps in there, does it again. And he doesn't even get to the third line before I go, okay, you did it.
Mm-hmm.
Then we did a couple more. I went,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is exactly what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who just jumps in there, doesn't necessarily know where it's going to end up, but is very willing to give it a try.
It's so that's I think that example is so helpful. I often ask faculty, like, can you remember an example? And I always feel like I'm putting them on the spot, but I really appreciate that of both giving the example of what they came in with was prepared. So it wasn't completely raw and messy, but then there was that willingness. It feels like it's hard to sometimes find that balance. Some students come in, they're like, I'm just completely open and I have done nothing. And then there's the people who are so prepared that it's hard to shake them, hard to find that flexibility, or hard to from what they were doing.
While you're speaking to a student like that, and I'm saying, well, imagine this thing, you can see them listen to you,
Mm-hmm.
and they a little bit, they leave the room, but they're starting to like step into that world, right? That's the prep. That's all I
Mm-hmm.
need. If you want to call that technique, that's fine, but it's not really. It's just an idea that I'm willing to make this trip.
And then we're getting to see what they'll be like with you for the next 4 years. You're going, this is what they'll be like in class,
Exactly.
probably. Of course, it's great.
And beyond that.
Well, and let's talk a little about the 4 years. So imagine you get that one exact student. I can't believe you're using an example who's not me, but it's fine. That student auditioning with King Lear, great. They're open. They're so ready to play. How does that student come out? You mentioned versatility, I think, is a real thing that you do. But what, from freshman to senior year, how do you see that CMU students often come out changed? What is the thing that they're really gaining from the school experience if they come in with all those qualities?
Well, then I think the 4 years does have to be about technique now. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we put them on stage, and you say, now if you just open your position up, I'm going to get your voice way back
Mm-hmm.
into the corner. If you're in the downright corner, make sure you get that onstage foot a little bit behind you, because then everybody gets to see you, that sort of thing. When you
Mm-hmm.
make an entrance, make sure you do this. When you make that turn up stage, don't do most of the line with your back to us.
Mm-hmm.
Retime it so that by the time you're turned around, we get the line again. So it's about that. It's about analyzing the text. What do you see in this text? What are the operative words? What should I remember about that speech, that monologue, that scene? So make sure that I do remember it, find a way to do that. So now we're adding technique to whatever that talent thing was, that sensitivity.
So true. Okay, I know for many years you were deeply involved in the showcase for CMU. I just love to hear a little bit, especially in your time with it. How do you feel like Carnegie Mellon prepared actors for their launch into the business, from really that business to the business class through the showcase, and maybe how has it changed in the many years since I went there?
I have to say, first of all, that once again, my ignorance was to my benefit. I had never seen a showcase when I went to Carnegie Mellon. I had no idea what that thing was. So at the end of the year, people said, "Hey, Don, come and see the senior showcase." And I went, "Oh, all right. What is that?" And I
Mm-hmm.
saw these students do 1-minute monologues, 2-minute scenes. And I thought, what in the world is this? We've worked with these guys for 4 years to have them sustain a performance
Mm-hmm.
throughout a couple of hours. And now we're trying to see who they are in a minute. That's crazy. Okay. But the more I got into it, the more I realized the power and the great opportunity that a showcase could be, because I realized that on one's own, it's very difficult to carve out a career.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have an agent to open the doors for you, it's going to be rough going. So now we have to figure out, what the agents want. And so when I got into it, I was really curious about how that worked. And at one point, one of the alums, an older alum who had been in a zillion movies, a face you would know actually, said to me, "Let me introduce you to my agent. I'd love for you to meet my agent. And I thought,
Mhm.
oh my God, what a great idea. Of course, we should talk to them. We
Mhm.
shouldn't just do a show and then see what happens, you know? So I went to this agent and I said, tell me, what are you looking for? Just the same question you had, you know? And, and he proceeded to tell me how he made choices about the actors that he would sign. And so I thought, well, let's build a showcase around that. So then I saw like just finding a scene maybe wasn't perfect. We needed to find a scene that was right for that actor,
Uh-huh.
that they were smart in doing, something that wasn't terribly overdone, and make sure that they could shine in those moments, which could mean that you could take a 5 minute scene and turn it into a 2 minute scene by just picking the highlights of
Mhm.
those moments. Now, the transitions are tough, but really tricky transitions are really interesting. You
Mhm.
know, I love you so much, but why do you treat me like this? You know, you go, oh wow, that was
Mhm.
A to Z in there in a moment there. So it's not so much now about the idea of supporting the playwright,
Uh-huh.
but seeing how the playwright can help you to show your bravest, smartest, most interesting sort of moments. You know.
Totally.
And so, you know, the agents, you know, I got braver and braver, and the agents were very happy to talk about this. I thought, oh, here am I being all timid about this. In
Mhm.
fact, they like talking about it because when they go to these showcases, they are really looking for new young talent. And these kids who are 21 years old have an advantage that is actually rather surprising because the agents are looking for who's the new kid on the
Who's
block.
next? Yep.
Yeah, who's next? And so you have to make sure that you find material that will show them and find a scene that will work for both people and make sure that in 2 minutes there's an arc to that scene, that there are definite tricky little, as I say, transitions and actions and switches. We're always talking about the switches. You know, how does the character go from this to this? Um, and that's a little different than when you're putting a play on and you're trying to serve the play. Now you're trying to find something that will be interesting every single and imaginative every second of it.
Totally. Yeah. No, and it's so interesting. The we always talk about like, showcase isn't everything. It's not your only chance. It's not, so many actors we know, of course, end up with agents that are not the people they met in showcase and they change. But the preciousness of that time of being new is really, that is something that I think you can hear as an actor, but I wish I had heard more deeply and really understood of like, you have this window when really so many doors are open to you because they are looking at you, when it's just harder to open those doors when you're 26, 27, 28. And they're like, you're old
Isn't it
news or
though?
whatever.
Really
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've heard of people who say, well, I'm going to go to LA and see how it works out. And I think, well, good luck. Who do
Yeah.
you know?
Yep.
How
Yep.
is that? How do you think you're going to get an audition? You won't even know about the audition. By the time you know that a thing is being cast, it's already
Yeah.
cast.
Yeah, exactly. So true.
Yeah.
All right, my last CMU question is: I just want to talk about the different platforms. Have you done some of them? Now as we've switched into Zoom, I don't know in terms of where your experience of from in person. I know when you first started this, it would have been like a papyrus scroll or whatever, but now then it was just normal in person auditions, and then Zoom. Just so the listeners know, Don is laughing. I'm not just being mean to him and just constantly calling him old. Like, I just need them to know that it's okay. But then with this new version of Zoom and now sometimes multiple callbacks, which has kind of shifted a little bit with Carnegie Mellon doing that more. How has that shifted the audition process for you? Maybe from that moment where in the room you're saying let's try it again, and there's that experience live. How has that shifted as we've now moved into some online environments?
That's really different. You know, it's very different because you really need to play to the microphone and to the camera and not much else. You know, because you've got to make that look real. In a live audition, take big old chances if you're in a big space for
Mm-hmm.
sure. But you better not do that if you're in front of a camera because now it's just going to look silly
Mm-hmm.
and pushed. You know, so it's got to be more real and more personal.
Yep.
So I'm saying more real and more personal, like it's an easy thing to do,
Right.
and it's
Snap your fingers,
actually
make it more real. Easy.
yeah, right, right. And some people think, oh, that means do nothing, and I go, no, no, no,
Mm.
no. It does not mean do nothing. It means be more specific with what you're going on. Read your scene partner. Make sure that you're playing from that scene partner, even if we don't see the scene partner, because we're certainly going to be watching you watch them.
Yep.
So it's a very different thing.
We talked about what you're sniffing out in terms of that larger capital T talent and sensitivity and versatility and openness and some of those things from an acting perspective. What about from a vocal perspective? For our actors, our non-musical theater actors, what are you listening for in the vocal instrument, if anything? I know some actors some acting schools will actually have the actors sing. I know Carnegie Mellon sometimes would do that. They say, I wouldn't mind hearing you sing, just a cappella. What are you listening for in the instrument, if anything, of what you're looking for?
Sometimes when actors sing, you see a different thing and you go, oh, look at that. The singing has opened up this instrument a lot. And there's it's a bigger, bolder, more sensitive opportunity. So you're glad that you got to see that, because there's more there than you even would have guessed, and you might see some boldness. There's lots of reasons to do that. There may be a little bit more art in the singing, and you're looking for that potential for a really interesting voice too. Now, on the opposite side,
you mean really interesting singing voice, or do you mean really interesting speaking voice? Both. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't have any expertise in singing, but I could certainly go, well, I could certainly listen to that for a couple of hours, but more in what the singing allowed them to do, because we want our singers to be good actors. It's an acting school. It happens that we sometimes sing and we sometimes dance, but it's an acting school. So we definitely want that. Now, I want to just say on the opposite side of things, when someone comes in with some very tricky speech issues, you go, okay, how willing do I guess this is going to be for the student to make a change? Because I don't see a career in that speech problem.
And is there an example? What do you mean by a tricky speech issue? What kind of thing would
a really thick, nasty lisp could be a problem. And so you might feel, even in the audition, you might open up the topic. Have you ever had any speech training, any speech therapy, and just see if anybody wants to talk about that, if they're aware of it, if they want to go after it, because we don't have speech therapy. We have speech, but not speech therapy in the 4 years. So I've had people that have had issues, and I go, look, if you want to meet over your lunchtime, let's work on this issue, and we can get a certain degree of progress. But you're going to have to do a lot of this on your own. And sometimes I might just go, I don't see this happening in 4 years.
Totally.
Nobody's perfect. That's okay.
Well, one person accepted, right?
Yeah, one person accepted.
Thank you. Please, Don. You can't say nobody's perfect on this podcast. No, let's take a little break. We're going to run a couple ads, pay some of those bills. And on the back end now, we're going to really get into voice and speech a little bit more deeply. I know we've started doing that already, but we'll get a little more deeply after the break. We are back with the great Donald Wadsworth. He has some tea massaging that beautiful instrument of his, and he's going to give the second half a go. I would love to start off with, can we define what a vocal coach is versus a dialect coach? Because at least the way you've talked about it is sometimes I'm a voice coach for celebrities or something, and sometimes I'm a dialect coach. And I know sometimes those can kind of be conflated and be kind of both. But how are those different, maybe in different media? What you're talking about, theater or film? I'd just love to hear a little bit about those.
They could be. I think it's all very vague, and I think people like the vagueness of it because they want to make it be their thing, whatever that thing happens to be. And also, I think that sometimes when you use the word dialect and dialect coach as a term, not everybody gets what that is. So I guess a voice coach might, I don't know, I'm guessing on this, but I think it might sound more general, and it might be that, all things that have to do with performance could be enhanced by someone who, who coaches, who makes suggestions to the actor about how to do that. So I worked on a show in which I was just helping the actor realize what was actually on the page. And so
almost text coach in that case, almost a text coach or whatever. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But I think like in a film, nobody would ever use the word text coach. It sounds too fancy schmancy, and British.
Yep.
Good Lord, you know.
But definitely
So
you're
anyway,
closer to an acting coach at this point. You were coaching their acting,
yes,
really.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. So anyway, so it could be anything, and sometimes actors themselves are more comfortable with different
Uh-huh.
titles like
Yep.
that, you know. And I've been called a dialogue coach too,
Uh-huh.
and what is that, you know? So it's whatever. It's
For the
whatever.
writing, are you giving some notes on the dialogue to the writers? Like, this doesn't sound real.
I don't think we meant however in that line, did we? No, we meant
No.
what instead.
Wheretofore? Yeah. And what have you learned? So from that experience of doing, especially, I mean, we'll talk about some of the incredible career of film and TV that you've come, a lot of it to Pittsburgh, but some of this amazing stuff that you've done on TV and film sets. What have you learned and maybe brought back to your teaching experience from, working with these celebrities and all these big budget productions, et
Yeah.
cetera?
Well, I think the idea there to tell the students is like, here's what you're going to need to know. This is how this is going to go. This
Hmm.
is what is expected of you, I would think. Having done a bunch of these things, I can tell you that this is how this goes. For example, if I'm working on a dialect in class, you know, and a student might be having trouble with it, the student might say something like, "Oh well, you know, if I get a job, I'll have a coach," and I'll go, "Maybe not."
Hmm.
I would not expect that to be the case. I think if you're a major star and the idea of the film success is based on using this particular actor, yeah, you may get a coach in the deal.
Hmm.
But if you're a day player where you've got 1 or 2 days, they're going to expect that you already can do the accent.
Yes.
And that'll probably be part of the audition, quite
Yes.
frankly.
Yep.
So, what I'm working on in my class right now, as a matter of fact, is how students can be their own coaches,
Yes.
how what they need to do to prepare for this kind of thing with no expectation that they're going to get some outside help.
Yep. It's the thing that I wish I had taken more from school, from the dialects, and not that the it wasn't there in the training, but the ability when auditioning to kind of self-regulate a subtle dialect, I feel like was
Mhm.
something that was so often I would realize in auditions of like I need to find not like a gentle New York dialect here, something that's like just I'm playing a cop, and so he's just got to be general blue collar, but they don't actually want to hear a New York accent or whatever. Those little twinges and stuff where you go for those parts where you have 3-4 lines. Yeah, they're just going to cast it based on that. It's not about what you do. It's not going to be. They're not going to be like, oh, we can give him lots of notes and adjustments and versatility. When it's 4 lines, this is like whoever does the thing that sounds like how we expected it to sound. You're in or whatever. So that was such a learning, especially for those sort of co-star 4 or 5 lines when that's what you're going in for. There is something about like nailing the dialect and of course what you look like, but you can't fully change what you look like. You can really
Yeah.
adjust, bringing my incredible high class voice down to whatever the lowers it needs to be, the lower levels.
I know, and I think your term about self regulation is a good one because so what can you do, you know, to tone that down?
Yeah.
Well, maybe instead of doing a lot of different sound changes, that's the term we would use in building a dialect. Maybe you don't have to make a lot. Maybe you can just do one little sloppy T or
Yep.
something like that, or you pronounce all, you know,
Yep.
instead of all, you know,
Yep.
and maybe you don't do a lot more than that. I have to tell you and your listeners, in the 80 zillion productions I've been involved in, no one ever said, let's go really strong in the accent.
Correct. Yep.
No one has ever said that.
And they often don't know unless it's like Matt Damon, it's a Boston accent. Like they often don't know exactly what it sounds like. They want the feeling often of that feels like the character, but they don't care if the sound changes are exactly correct or what. It's like if
Oh,
you're like, oh, that's actually not consistent. If I did that, I probably would also do that. They don't care. They just want it to feel like what TV feels like in a blue collar person or whatever.
absolutely. Which is why you would have a coach there anyway,
Right.
so that they can make those changes for you or subtract some of it. Yes.
Do you have any fun on-set stories from the Tom Hardys or the Chris Pines or some of those, amazing people that you got to work with? Any, ridiculous stories or, it doesn't have to be from those two, but of going, this was really fun and challenging. Or I know you've sometimes talked about when productions have asked for a Pittsburgh accent and some. those where you're like, I don't know if, or Pittsburgh dialect, I don't know if you know what that sounds like, or any
Yes,
of those
right,
things.
right. Yeah, for a CBS show, they brought me on to do this show called $1, which was a really clever idea of following $1 bill through different hands and
Hmm.
different crimes and things like that. And it happened that it took place in Pittsburgh. So they said, "Well, we want to do a Pittsburgh dialect," and I went, "Really? Are you sure you want to?"
And now you
Because
don't. Now you do not.
exactly, because even when people do it really well, people who have never heard it before are going to go, "What is that thing?" Because
Yes.
nobody knows what that is. Nobody knows what a Baltimore dialect
Uh-huh.
is, So you can do it really well, but is it worth it?
Yeah.
So anyway, on that particular show, I started to teach these actors. All of them were from New York and LA. What the dialect was, and they just would look at me dumbfounded, like, "What are you talking about?" So I would say, "Well, we say downtown, and we say frown. Don't be frowning at me." And they would go, "What is that?" But they got really into it.
Yes.
And some people, when they get to the dialects, they feel like, okay, now I have a character.
Uh-huh.
Now that I can do the dialect. Um, and at times I would go, okay, you guys are being too good at this now. You have to
Chill
stop.
out. Be a
Yeah,
person.
it's
Yeah.
full
Yeah.
out. It's too much because all we're doing is listening to the crazy,
Yes.
level of this dialect. But you want to be able to go there.
Yep.
And the aphorism that you often hear from people is that from actors will say, "Well, I'll go fully out, then I'll pull it back." Well, a lot of people can't pull it back.
Uh-huh.
That's a silly idea
Yep.
because doing less is actually quite
So
tricky
hard.
to do.
Yep.
It's very difficult to go. I worked with Bob Hoskins, rest his soul, and tried to help him with an American dialect. And it was very tricky for him because he could do a really strong, silly, cartoonish
Uh-huh.
Brooklyn.
Yep.
But then when we said, okay, the characters from like Vermont, like really hard to do.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
No,
And
I that exact experience with I was helping my partner with, she was auditioning for a TV show that takes place in Pittsburgh, and it just basically just said no Southern dialect. They didn't want it to sound Southern. They're like, you can try it if you want, but don't let it get crazy or whatever. They think they were trying to say be subtle with anything that you do or
yeah,
whatever. But it
right.
was sort of a blue collar Pittsburgh, and same experience of I could kind of teach the sounds, but I couldn't teach a subtle. She couldn't get it at a level that was, it's a quick audition. Obviously, I'm sure if we'd worked longer, but the idea of doing it in a way that I'm like, but how would a person actually sound like if you were from Pittsburgh, as opposed to oh no, come on, Dan,
I know.
some of those
The
sounds
cartoon
so
is
hard.
easier to do.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
without a
So
doubt.
you just have to make a decision about exactly what to hit and then let everything else be, let it relax. So who is that person? So that
Uh-huh.
person's really good in certain ways, but not in all ways. And so
Yeah.
you get this little tricky little sound. Like one of my students just called me, I think yesterday, and said, I have to make a tape with a Polish accent, but they're asking it to be really subtle. And I
Mm.
said, okay, here's two things to do.
Yes.
Just do this and nothing else.
Yep.
And let's see how that sounds. And if it works, cool.
Yep.
It might, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was realistic. But at any rate, you give it a try and you do not the most you can do, but the least you can get away with.
That's so smart. Can we talk pivot a little bit to kind of speech in the 21st century, and
Yes.
how maybe it's changed since the great Edith Skinner was teaching you, and she pronounced
Yeah.
it to us so trippingly on the tongue all those years ago. Um, I guess I'd love to start with you. How do you feel like something like a standard American dialect, or even what Edith Skinner would teach as a general American, which when we've done, I think can still to most people sound a little bit stilted, or I've been accused of
Mhm.
sounding European, even though I'm like, I'm just doing general American. Um, how does that fit into a 21st century actor's tool bag?
This is a tricky topic now because we're still in the transition. When I was in school and she was my teacher and her proteges were my teachers too, we had a very strict regimen of how things sounded.
Yes.
Okay. And again, as a student who knew nothing, I said, yes, ma'am, let me do everything that you say.
Yep.
And I don't regret that because later on I realized I had to make some decisions on my own about how far to go, but at least I had that level. So at that time, that was the way to go. I remember, learning things like it's not Tuesday, it's Tuesday, and
Tuesday.
I go,
Yeah.
Tuesday. Oh, cool. And so I immediately thought, then I should be sounding like that all the time.
Uh-huh.
Sure, you know. And so, and some of that I think was smart, and some of that I absolutely did and still do. And and I remember, like you, when I went out there, people would say, "Are you British?"
Yeah, you're from Sweden. Something's interesting about you. It's
Yes, I know.
indefinable.
I
Yeah.
know. And I never liked to hear that, because then I thought, okay, that's not what I really wanted.
Uh-huh.
I want this to be like clean, but not effete and not
Uh-huh.
effective.
Uh-huh.
And definitely not British unless I decide that I want to make it
Yeah.
British. Now, in the past, certainly in the past 10 years or so, we look at all of that as a very specific dialect.
Yep.
Yes, some people say Tuesday. Absolutely. Some people say horrify and horrible rather
Mhm.
than horrify and horrible. So, but my advice now is, who are you? You know, are you a person who knows that, and
Who are
who
you
would
as the
have
character, you're saying? Does
as
the
the
character know that
character,
or not?
as the
But
character?
still helpful, do you feel like, to have that as a touchstone of going, okay, well, that allows me to go all the way up to if I learned an RP, or if I learned to, if I
Yeah,
need to play that kind of character, but
right.
obviously not that all characters are going to sound like that.
Yeah, but again, it's all about the ability to be adaptable, which you could actually say is the definition of acting, is being adaptable to
Yeah.
whatever that situation is. So you absolutely need to know that, just like you would need to know it for movement, for example. And maybe the ballet training would
Uh-huh.
really inform a certain character in a Moliere play,
Right.
but
But not
not
every character is walking
every time.
around like a
No,
ballerina.
that's
Yeah.
right.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a doozy of a question. It's my last hard question. That's not true. There's more hard ones coming. But this is the hardest question I'll ask, which is just about the classical text in Standard American, and kind of how do you feel about that sound expectation? And if you want to, we can go, and I think you're saying there certainly is an EDI element in terms of sort of the whiteness of that sound. And we can do that if we want. But also, I think maybe purely from a class perspective, I think I've always been uncomfortable with the idea that like Shakespeare is supposed to sound a certain way, that, if productions would, I remember working at the Shakespeare Theater of DC and hearing, well, this is what a Shakespeare sound is. This is what a Shakespeare voice is.
Right.
Right. And that feels kind of exclusionary. And yet, maybe partially from my training bias, it does sound appreciably worse to me in practice often when things are quote unquote mispronounced or carelessly chosen in terms of how things are sound. So I know it's also difficult maybe to separate the kind of control from the experiment in terms of, a lot of people who sound a certain way might be because they also are trained in other elements and et cetera. But I just wanted, what do you think in terms of like 10 years from now, or, 5 years from now, as we're putting on classical, Shakespeare text in an American way, how would that sound in your, in your production, in your perfect mind?
I think you still have to go down to the very basic question of, who is this character? So, um, when you look at the dialogue and you say, look how incredibly smart and intellectual and clever the dialogue is. Therefore, how can I reveal that in the way that I speak it? Okay. When you talk about Shakespeare and other classics, you have to remember there are not a lot of Shakespeare plays that take place in England.
Hmm.
You know, so like, why are the characters? Why do the characters have a British dialect or even remotely sound British? They don't need to.
Hmm.
Obviously, the history plays should, they would make sense. But if you were being really smart about this thing, if anybody cared, you would have to say, well, in the 1450s, nobody had what we know as a British dialect
Uh-huh.
now anyway.
Right.
So how can I use the text to make clear what's happening and where we are? Okay, so Twelfth Night happens in a illusory sort of place. Romeo and Juliet is in Italy. So why can't we just let it be as neutral as
You don't
possible?
want to do an Italian accent for
Oh my God!
Romeo? Oh my
Can you
God.
imagine?
But soft, what light through on the window breaks.
You would actually have to hurt people to do that. That would not be legal, even. No.
Fair, fair. I think listeners, let us know. I think you'd want to see my Romeo and Juliet production of All Italian. No.
I might be busy that day. No, I think we have to say, who are you? Who is your character? And how can we reveal, no matter what play, no matter what dialect we're talking about, how can we reveal who you are through the way that you speak?
So you think if you're directing a show, we're not necessarily going to have a shared aesthetic of we all say Tuesday when it comes up. You know,
Maybe
some
not.
characters might, some characters may, but that's not necessarily, you know, a shared dialect. You know, certainly I think that's when I was out of school, that was still pretty common. It was starting to change. Some companies were not. Some were saying, no, we're gonna, you know, we may, you know, still obey the same text rules, but we're gonna let any kind of sound come out. But some really were saying, for the sake of consistency in our production, everybody sounds basically like this. Maybe the fools sound a little differently, but most of the other characters are going to sound something like a standard American, a general American, which when we say general American, for the listeners who don't know, that maybe is like a slightly elevated mid-Atlantic. I don't know if that's helpful a way of framing it, but it's going to still sound relatively stilted compared to like even how I'm speaking now.
Well, hopefully none of it's stilted, but I
Fair,
do
yes.
agree that everybody could be in the same world in some form or another. And we might make a distinction between the royalty and the well-educated and the thieves and robbers and,
Uh-huh.
comic characters. But yes, I do agree that they sort of have to be somewhat in the same world. Nothing should make you kind of go, wait a minute, where are we? Who is that?
Yeah.
None of that should make us stop the play.
Well, and I do feel like this is something that colleges and really any kind of training is actively wrestling with, is as we try to take away that maybe specific sound, which has a certain expectation. It's like, how do you also keep the same level of technique that, you know, we do, you know, that there is still the same openness of the voice, and there still is some training and element toward what are the poetic techniques that are happening in the text, and how can I
Mhm.
elevate this, which is, you know, it is poetry, it is verse. How do I elevate this without necessarily saying it has to sound a certain way or sound like this? I think that is a challenge that right now I think we see good examples of both extremes, but it's not a ton that's going right in that place of going, it doesn't sound that stilted, but it does really lift the poetry. I think it's just really tricky.
Well, I think you're right. I think we are in a transition period. But I'll tell you, I had this experience, and it sounds like a minor thing, in the beginning of this year, or last year rather, when I was teaching the first years, and we were looking at medial T sounds, T's in the middle of a word like
Hmm.
little and pretty, right? And so I was giving a note about pretty, and the girl in my class said, "Well, yeah, but I say it with a D. I say pretty." And I go, "I know you do, but what does your character do?"
Hmm.
You know, so I want you to be able to go there, as you were saying earlier. I want you to be able to go there if that's what we
Right.
need. But I don't want you to tell me this is the way I always speak, because we're not playing you.
And you're not asking them to take away their ability to say pretty in real life. I think that was, I remember some of my
Right.
classmates, especially early on, were like, exactly what you said. Are we supposed to speak like this all the time? You know, Ethan and I, who were best friends in college, would often sort of speak to each other in standard American as just like sort of a joke. And then people are like, you're doing it all the time. Like, you're right. I have to stop. I can't, don't do it. But that you're not actually saying in real life, you need to be doing this all the time just to have the ability to do it.
Okay, but let me just bring up an opposing point. Another side of that coin is when you meet someone, you say, that's a trained actor.
Hmm.
That actor sounds clear, smart, and like that.
Yep.
Hopefully not affected.
Well, you
But
failed at that. You did everything else for me, but you gave affected it's happened. I've been accused of it. I can't stop it. It's everyone on the podcast knows affected is what we are. Um, let's talk a little bit about kind of teaching and the business, because you know you've been someone I think has been so successful at. You know, you have this wonderful teaching career of now. I keep joking of 7 decades, but multiple decades of teaching, and this wonderful three. It's multiple decades. That's really impressive. You know, and growth within that realm of things, but also have really maintained a successful professional life and, you know, continue to grow that part of your career when in school. So I'd love to hear about like how do you balance that, and what has that been like for you, kind of finding that dual career?
well, if I'm on a job, I'm going to do my best on the job, of course. But there's also an I in there somewhere that says, "Oh, I need to bring this back to class.
Hmm.
This was very interesting." So I think as it turned out, rather than be an actor who teaches, I think I'm probably more a teacher who acts.
Uh-huh.
And who coaches. So that the teacher I is always very very alive. So that like, for example, recently I did a video game. I did this video game called Fallout 76. And apparently this is a very big deal. I don't know anything
This
about
is not the
video games.
76th version of Fallout, right? This is like in
I don't
1976.
know.
My
Maybe it
God,
is. I don't
that's a lot of Fallouts.
know. I know. Anyway, there were lots of shootings and, apocalyptic moves in this game. Anyway, my point is that I went in there without knowing exactly how this was going to go. So in the booth, they gave me these pages, which only had my character's lines on them. And so I had no idea what was going on
Am I
at
being
any point.
shot? Am I happy? What's happening here?
No, I'm not even kidding. It was exactly like that because I would have lines like, "Oh my God, not him," and I would go, "What happened? What happened? What happened?" And they would say, "Well, your men are dying." And I guess I was a sergeant or something like
Uh,
that, a badass sergeant. Which, of course, since you don't
Perfectly
see me,
cast
yes,
only in voice. Can that be
not at
pulled
all,
off?
not at all. So I would go, well. So what do I feel about this? And so given that the producer who's in my headphones and who's in LA at the time says, "Tell you what, let's do two versions of everything. We'll do an A version and a B version, and sometimes the A version can be like really pissed, really angry about this thing, and then the B version can be like a broken heart and
Mm.
maybe some guilt over the fact that your men are dying off." So I did that a lot. It was quite fun, really.
Mhm.
But the teacher in me says, wait till I tell my students
Mm.
that this is a possibility, because it was really cool to do,
That is so cool.
even though you didn't have any idea the context of the thing.
And just such trust. I mean, maybe it's not as high stakes for a video game than it would be for a big
Yeah,
movie, but such trust in the director, whoever's doing that, going, all right, don't make me sound like an idiot as you piece
yeah,
together B with
yeah.
A and A with B and all
Well,
those things.
as many times as I could make him laugh is how I felt I was successful. I go, oh, that's great. Let's go with the A version.
Well, this is a perfect transition. My next question was just about a career in voiceovers. And, I think we are going to at some point try to have a voiceover agent and maybe some other voiceover artists on the pod, because I know that's a big interest of a lot of our alumni. But I'd just love to hear, how have you been so successful at it? And any tips for maybe students right out of college, or maybe it's a 30-year-old actor with a good voiceover agent and a fancy microphone who wants some of that voiceover money? What do we think?
I don't have a really good answer for you on that. I think everybody who's made a career for themselves will say, well, here was my path. But
Hmm.
everybody's path is quite different and really, really surprising, I think. It certainly has been for me. I think that somehow people got to know that this accent thing was kind of like my deal.
Uh-huh.
So I would get asked to try out for things that had either quirky voices, funny character voices, or accents. So
Hmm.
that got to be known, probably because it was connected to the coaching. I'm not
Hmm.
really sure,
Hmm.
but these days it's different. These days, you probably have to create a good voiceover demo and put that in the hands of the right people, which is tricky to do. And yes, an agent is going to be super helpful, but you mustn't be afraid to be aggressive about this kind of thing.
Hmm.
Put yourself out there, find out who's doing the kind of thing you want to do, and connect to them. And if they say no thanks, then they say no thanks. Okay,
Hmm.
but you've got to go out there and be bold about giving this thing a try. But you also have to learn what is going on in the business.
Oof.
You can't sit there and expect people to call you. It's not going to work. And I'm saying that because I see that a lot of my students, that they think somehow magically it's all going to come about. It just doesn't
Yeah.
work like that.
Well, and so often we talk about the different, industries. When someone says the business or whatever, I'm like, you're talking about theater, TV, film,
Yeah,
commercials, voiceover. They're already, and it seems like within voiceovers, just within that realm, there are commercial spots and there are video games and there's audiobooks. I mean, there's so many
right.
different careers, even within just the career of voiceovers. Where you can be doing completely different things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, stay active and stay very aware. It's not that difficult to do, to find out what's going on. You use in your browser, you use things like playbill.com and deadline.com and things like that. Find out what in the hell is going on. And then there is just the reputation thing. So I remember being on a film not too long ago, where I spoke to the production coordinator and I said, "Can you just tell me something? How did I get this job?"
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Oh, well, we worked with you on a couple of films earlier. That's how." And I
Mm-hmm.
went, "Oh, okay." And one time I was on a TV thing. This was way back. And I asked the casting director, I said, of all the people that were up for this job, I played a period piece where I was an attorney working against Clarence Darrow. And I said, "How did I get this role?" And they said, "In the audition, you pronounced this word exactly right." You, that's true.
That's amazing.
The line was something like, "I won't stand for this harassing." And they went,
Heresy.
"Harassing."
Perfect.
I know.
Well, there's a
Talk
good
about
argument against what we were saying of like, you don't need to say. You're like, no, you do need to have a clear actor. It's going to get me jobs.
if it's affected, it's affected. That's the character.
I just wanted any advice for the parents of young artists seeking this all, right? I know I'll say in this case, you swayed my mother, who almost immediately loved you and basically
Oh,
hated any artistic teacher I had at that point. Because she was like, "Why are you
ooh.
taking me away from computer science? My son should not be doing acting." But she really, I think, listened to you, all those years ago at Carnegie Mellon pre-college and goes, "Well, I like that, Don Wadsworth." But what would you say to our parent listeners in terms of just how they can best support their children on their paths, whether these are 16, 17 years about to go to college or recent graduates, et cetera? What do you feel as parents has been the most successful in supporting and helping their students, their children?
Well, the support is the word. I think that's the word I would use, is to find out what it's actually about. Because I think a lot of people just assume that it's all about, rouge and mascara, and you say these lines that you memorize. So I think it might be helpful when the student is really passionate about developing this sort of potential career, that
Mm-hmm.
the parents find out what's involved. You mentioned before, like if a parent was looking at a curriculum and they saw something like speech, and they might go, "Speech? I'm paying for you to
Right.
be
Didn't we do that
speech?"
in elementary school? Wasn't there a speech
Yeah.
tutor or whatever? Yeah.
Right. So I think them being at least as aware as their kids are, as their children are, about what's involved, how tricky it is, what the rewards are, how the business works. They might find it a little daunting, but I think it helps for them to feel like they're partners rather than someone that has to prove that the acting career is a worthy one.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That is such good advice to those parents, and obviously you are dedicated if you've made it 3 hours into this episode with us all. If people want to hear more from you, they want to know more, they want more Don Wadsworth in their life. Of course, they can listen to that Bible on the YouTubes or whatever. But is there anything else that places they should be checking you out? Are you on socials? Do you want them to be tagging you on LinkedIn, or what do you want?
No. I don't want to do any of that. But I really don't. There's too many. There's too many pitfalls in all that too, and I keep hearing terrible things. There are things that I think like, is it really that bad? I don't experience, that stuff. But anyway, at any rate, the performance I've done most recently is this Netflix show called The Chair, in which I
Yes.
play a cranky professor. Imagine
The range.
the
My
range.
God, you
Yeah,
talk about versatile actors from Cranky
absolutely.
Professor by day to Cranky Professor on television. My God,
That's a real step forward. I know my damnable student said, "Oh, of course that's the role you got."
you're like, okay, I'm acting here. I'm very nice in real life, which we all know you're very. If people who've watched The Chair will see the difference of the character, of course.
Perhaps yes, and perhaps no.
Well, Don, thank you so much for the time. This was such a joy.
Oh, it was wonderful for me. Thank you so much.
Oh, heck yeah. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Don Wadsworth. It was truly a joy to me and really very special to get to do it. For this episode's takeaway, it's going to be a short one. I just want to talk a little bit about being an advocate. I've mentioned that in the beginning, and I'll say it here. Don was really a crucial advocate for me early in my professional life and kind of a role model for me in wanting to be an advocate for my students. It's one of the reasons I got into coaching. There's something so special about an adult who can really see a young artist, with capital SC, their full potential and what is in their heart through whatever teenage defense mechanisms or anxieties or whatever's going on with the kid. If you can see through that and really see the heart of the artist, that's a special adult. And I think this element of belief in yourself from someone who a young person trusts and respects is an absolutely critical element to taking the leap from teenage actor to adult actor, right? It's a difficult and scary jump to make, kind of abandoning your childhood tricks that may have worked for you to now go into this more sensitive vulnerability of this kind of high level acting that you may have heard about. And I think that is made so much easier when you have someone else looking at you and saying, you can do it. And not just someone who's just like a general cheerleader who's like, it can be done generally, but that they're looking at you and saying, you are capable of this. You're capable of more. You can do this thing that you can touch this magic thing that we've all touched. Because, of course, the ultimate most important thing in an actor is that the actor can believe in themselves, right? That's why this step or this sort of mentorship is so important. Nobody will ever want to watch a Hamlet stand alone on stage and ask us questions if that actor doesn't believe in their core that they should be standing there asking those questions. Nobody's going to want to watch a Bobby sing Being Alive if the actor playing Bobby doesn't think that they have something worthy to share with 1,000 people who paid a lot of money to watch them stand under a spotlight. And that kind of genuine belief, I just don't think it comes innately and just maintains itself in most people. Most people somewhere along the way are going to need a little bit of fostering, especially as young people shift and grow into new young adults who maybe are different than their 14-year-old selves or their 16-year-old selves, and now they're stepping into their 18-year-old selves, and they need somebody to be able to say, I see you, and there's something special there, and you keep going. So, a shout out to those mentors and coaches and teachers who instill belief in their students each day. Whether you're the kind of cheerleader who kind of rah-rahs for them or the drill sergeant who pushes them to do their best, I think you really are creating a world of power for young people who will hopefully turn around and do the same. And students, if I can give you a little homework assignment, give some love to those people in your life while they are with you. You might know better than they that they're having a lifelong impact on you. I certainly felt that way with Don, that I was aware in the moment. I was like, this is someone who's having a lifelong impact on me, in those couple months. And maybe most importantly, the best gift you could give them is accept the gift of belief in you that they're giving you. Cherish it. Cherish that belief. You actually do them a disservice if you throw it away and give in to too much self-doubt. So really own that belief that if this person believes in you, if they can believe in you, the least you can do is believe in yourself. And certainly you can believe in this podcast, giving us a 5-star rating wherever you listen and a review wherever you review us. We'd like a nice review. You can shout out some mentors maybe in that review. You can also follow us at Mapping the College Audition on Instagram or follow MTCA on all of the socials media in the show notes. To my young artists out there mapping their journeys, heresy on a Tuesday, all the way downtown. The rest is a silence. We'll see you next week.